The Iridium Constellation Project by Melanie Johnson and Lola Suarez Novak. The Iridium Satellite Phone Company began as an idea for the Motorola engineer Barry Bettinger in 1985. He envisioned being able to have global communication. His wife one day came home and complained to him about having trouble making calls from the Bahamas, and this got him thinking, what if there could be a global communication device that could be very clear, sending texts, pictures, voice calls across the country, regardless of where the person would be. It was supposed to consist of a constellation of 66 low Earth orbiting satellites that would allow callers to communicate in several ways from any global location, no matter how remote. It was a brilliant vision and an alternative source of communicating. Even though the cell phones were on the rise, they hadn't gotten to several of those remote areas that they wanted to target. They really thought that in times of natural disaster, that this satellite communication would be groundbreaking. When Barry Bettinger brought it to some of the Motorola executives, they passed on the idea, saying that it was too expensive. But Robert Galvin, a Motorola chairman, gave the go-ahead on it, and Motorola had been very successful in all of their previous ventures, so they felt that this too would end in success. These satellites were supposed to be closer to the Earth, which was going to decrease the size of the phone and eliminate voice delays. This would really improve upon the older satellites that had existed previously that were several more miles away from the Earth, and you needed large, bulky phones to be able to use that program, as well as the voice delays were very major. Motorola established the Iridium LLC as a separate company, with Motorola being the largest equitable shareholder. In November of '98, Iridium began their commercial telephone service, and satellite paging began a couple of weeks later. $5 billion was the rough total spent on this whole network, starting from its initial vision to finally the product and services that they launched. These funds were actually raised from a combination of debt, an IPO, equity investments by several corporate shareholders, and this included the Kyocera Corporation, Sprint, and Motorola. They had projected a hopeful course for the company to achieve the subscriptions of around 400,000 people, and that would help them to break even. They were also estimating that 50,000 more subscribers a month in 1999 would also put them in a very lucrative position. Unfortunately, a variety of issues afflicted the company. Only 10,000 subscribers had joined as of May '99. And with all of their loans, finally in '99 of August, Iridium defaulted. And they filed for bankruptcy, Chapter 11. In 2000, Iridium still only had 50,000 subscribers and decided to terminate the services, and they were planning to deorbit the 66 satellites. Initially, Iridium did not rise from bankruptcy, and Motorola did have a financial exposure of about $2.2 billion, even though some people say that may not be quite as much because they did recoup about $750 million from contracts that they had with Iridium, but still, that's a large sum of money. Now that you have a little bit of a background on Iridium, basically this report is going to cover positive and negative issues regarding the Iridium Satellite Company. The company had a great concept of making communication global in all forms, but unfortunately had faulty management, a non-secure business plan, egregious amounts of debt, and that failure erupted, and it was spectacular. The project reviews the great vision and brilliant efforts in directing and developing an incredibly complex satellite constellation, the management's unnecessary mistakes, and the possible alternate paths that could have saved this company from demise and financial ruin. I loved this little diagram that I added in here because it really showed how They felt they were going to go global, and it was, though complex technologically, they wanted to make it simplistic for the user, and it ended up completely backfiring from bad planning. We're first going to delve into the issues that were concerning this Iridium case. There were four major ones, and you can see this annual cost comparison chart compared to some of the other carriers. You can see Iridium is quite high in the cost area, and this is part of their downfall. But first, we'll get into cellular build-out that dramatically reduced the target's market need for Iridium services. At first, the cellular game was not in remote areas, and unfortunately, from vision to completion, Iridium took 11 years. A lot of landscape competitors can change dramatically, and it did. And instead of reevaluating, they moved forward, and it ended up that their technology was outdated and their competitor landscape had completely changed. So though they had focused on targeting the business working person that would travel to these remote areas, that would constantly need, communication without interruption, the cellular market had moved in on that same business class, and this reduced the amount of target customers that they were initially going for. There were also technological limitations, and it was very expensive, as I said, seeing the chart below. It was like $3,000 just to be able to have the hardware to be able to use the system, and something like $5 a minute. Not only was that an issue, but the limitations was sometimes you couldn't use it in a building, sometimes you couldn't use it in a moving car. So it really, the whole point of making it more accessible and easier use for the customer anywhere was getting chipped away. The poor operational execution also plagued Iridium. They had board members that were mostly partnered with Iridium, and so they did not support or put pressure on those parties that needed pressure to execute goals of planning and rolling out the whole program. They didn't have adequate sales and marketing support, and this just helped Iridium to completely crash. To make it a bit simpler to understand, there were basically three forces combined that led Iridium to their failure. First being escalating commitment. This occurs when decision makers have already committed significant resources to a project, commit even more resources after receiving feedback that the project is failing. Investments in obsolete technology without resale value or alternative uses. This is exactly what I spoke about in the slide before, the situation that Iridium found itself in. Again, it took 11 years for the concept to be developed fully, and the business plan eroded during that time because there was no reevaluation. The build-out of the cellular market decreased Iridium's number of target customers, as I mentioned before, and the design, operational, cost problems with the phones created such issues regarding usage limits that it detracted from what the initial positive marks were to be for this whole company. Motorola executives still pushed the project even with flaws in the business plan, and mostly this was because of their own personal gains and personal interests. Sayano's leadership was a double-edged sword. Dr. Edward Sayano was appointed in '96 to be the CEO of Iridium before the program was launched. He was a tough leader. He believed in leaders' responsibility to support their projects at all costs and had been with Motorola for several years beforehand. He was a leader that started projects and made sure they got finished. This was believed to be a great asset to Iridium to have somebody like this on their team. The only issue is that he was paid through a contractual obligation by Iridium for stock options, and this investment meant that anything that happened with Iridium greatly impacted his pocketbook. This gave him great incentive to push the project forward, instead of cutting the losses and moving forward when they should have. His leadership and investment made him a great candidate in the beginning, but in the end, these same characteristics made him unwilling to relinquish this project and the obsolete technology and failed business plan along with it. The third force that helped with Iridium failing was that the board did not provide adequate corporate governance. In 97, there were 28 board members, and 27 of them were Iridium partners, directors, or employees. And this created two very big problems. First of all, the board lacked any outside director insight. They needed more expertise and diversity and viewpoints to not have such a slanted point of view. Because most of the members were in partnership with Iridium, it made it very difficult to apply pressure to these partners when needed in very important situations. A great example of this was the lack of necessary sales and marketing infrastructure, and this was needed before the product launch, and not enough was done, and therefore the numbers failed severely. Therefore, the board limited the ability for Iridium to work effectively with its partners, and it failed to provide proper corporate guidance. So Iridium had 3 strikes against them already. Recommendations and lessons learned. With every mistake and with every failure, there's some lesson that can be taken out of it. And in this case, some of the lessons are part of the recommendations. Projects with long concept to development times, they really need to be constantly aware of changing competitive landscape and the company's ability to provide the products and services. The executives need to evaluate these projects as real options and set up a model to analyze and strategically plan for further investment and increased returns. Once the model is made, there needs to be a reevaluation, the important reevaluation, because now it can be done with better understanding of the products, services, and the competitive landscape that is currently happening. With the reevaluation, Iridium could have saved themselves from terrible failure and bad business planning. They could have overcome design flaws, or at least planned to overcome the design flaws, but they weren't able to, and the costs rose, and nothing operated well. So the investment in research and development was appropriate and well placed, but the following investment was really where the failure began. Executives should have built into the business plan an option value assessment. It would have preserved Iridium from being pushed forward regardless of all the negative feedback and reality. Many of the board members and executives had a stake in the company moving forward, and this created a push to continue when there really should have been a halt. Some other recommendations and lessons. The costs of risky projects can be reduced and opportunities for contracting and learning can be seized. Clearly, this Iridium project was very expensive, was very complex technologically, and wasn't managed well, and had a lot of problems. This spells out risky. Some of the areas of risk that they had been made aware of were the fact that it was a highly leveraged capital structure. This put them almost in immediate position for debt. And if it didn't perform the way they had hoped, and it absolutely did not. There were design limitations, including the phone size. There were service limitations, including severe degradation in cars, buildings, and urban areas. The handset and service pricing was outrageous. The build-out of cellular networks that we had already spoken about. A lack of control over partners' marketing efforts. All of these, and this was only a few of the list, makes a project high risk, and Iridium showed all of the signs. But in all of this negativity, there can be some lessons learned and some gains. Through all of the monetary disease, Iridium did expose Motorola to contractual gains and to the development of satellite technology, which they were already interested in, and also the patent protection that goes hand in hand. If the CEO would have been less driven by his stock option, personal profit potential that was in his contract, he would have moved forward and not held on and pushed when there were major warning signs. The governing board should be diversified, have that outsider's point of view, as well as reducing the number of partnership board members. Pressure can be placed upon those partners when you need to execute those crucial steps. The board has to be supportive and vigilant, and proper plans for sales and marketing need to be devised and implemented. Without a proper plan, you're planning for failure. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.